Hi, I'm Maggie Alfonsi, former England rugby player and now a MasterCard ambassador. MasterCard is proud to sponsor the Telegraph Women's Sport podcast hosted by Dame Laura Kenny. MasterCard has championed women's sport for over 25 years. Discover more at mastercard.co.uk/impact.
Welcome to the Telegraph's Women's Sport podcast with me, Laura Kenny. In this episode, we're talking about a topic that is at the heart of truly levelling the playing field, sexism. We're going to be exploring the disparities that are still present between men and women when it comes to sport. We'll be looking at the gender pay gaps that still remain in women's sport, dissecting the lack of women in senior leadership and coaching positions, and challenging the culture of sexual harassment and misogyny that often finds its way into women's sport. So I'm just going to dive right on in with this subject. I think sexism is just a really big subject that can take us down many avenues to talk about. From my point of view, I've never experienced like a massive scandal as such, that we hear about, like these pretty horrific, to be honest, cases when it comes to how females are getting treated in the sporting world. But I think from a cycling point of view, you can very much tell, or you could do, it is certainly getting better, that track cycling, I'll talk about specifically, was very much a male-only sport at one point, because the words that are used, or were used, because we have changed the narrative now of how we talk about certain things and positions, were just men focused. So for example, in a team pursuit, we all line up on the track in very different positions, and it's 1, 2, 3 and 4, but when I first started, it was called man 1, man 2, man 3, man 4, and now I never really thought, it never even occurred to me, you just accept it. Like when you go into that sort of world, you just accept, well, that's just the language that gets used. And then Katie Archibald, actually, it was that initiated the thought process in my head, and she was like, why do we say man like it's a position on the track? Why are we not saying position 1, or as now P1, P2, P3, P4? But you just, like, for me I just accepted it because I just thought, well, they're just the words. And I got onto the programme quite young, so I wasn't going to be that person that was like, hang on, this doesn't seem right. And so I just sort of went, well, this is fine. And so I guess that you can sort of tell. I always, in the background, I guess, also felt like the men's team was maybe put before us in terms of track time, like they would get on the track very much before us. And it never seemed, I guess, like a sexism thing, but I think if you peel back the layers, it is just the fact that it was a man's sport at one point, like there wasn't female events at one point. And I think we are still kind of adapting to that. I guess we are now getting to the point where everything is very much equal, but there are some things that historically have meant still on. And I guess this is where my conversation is going to start. And like, I guess another thing is like barriers. What do I think the barriers are with things like language or people experiencing sexism? To help me dive into this topic today, I'm joined by not one, but two guests. First, we have Dr Stacey Pope, Professor in the Department of Sport and Exercise at Durham University, and a leading figure in the area of women's sports fans, gender and equality. Also joining me is Yvonne Harrison, the current CEO of Women in Football, who has over 20 years' experience working with the sporting industry. So welcome to you both.
Thanks for having us.
So let me just start with a fact that I find quite shocking. So it says girls as young as 5 years old feel that they don't belong in sport, and only 30% of parents believe playing sport is very important for their daughters, compared to 41% of parents that think it's important for their sons. So for me, I mean, just that very stat itself, I'm like, how is it that we are thinking that sport for boys is more important than it is for females? Like, I just find that mad that is the reality of a lot of people's mindset.
I would agree with that, and I think your point around language is really important, because working in the football industry, it's, United and Arsenal are playing. Well, United men and Arsenal men, or it's the World Cup and it's the Women's World Cup.
Yeah.
And these things are really subtle, but they're important, and I think more and more we're starting to see that narrative shift, and particularly in England with the Women's FA Cup and the Men's FA Cup. So we're starting to see that, and it's really important. I think the point that you raise is that this is systemic. You know, sport was predominantly for men, by men, and therefore the thought processes are exactly that. When we look at equipment, when we look at, you know, even access, for example, into a boardroom, only for men at a given time, and not that long ago actually. So there's a whole series of things. But I have 2 boys and a girl.
Okay.
So for me, and I've always been very passionate about sport and predominantly in grassroots sport actually. But for me, being involved in sport was very much the things that you talked about, Laura, which was it's about learning to win, learning to lose. It's about building friendships. It's about communication. And actually, these are really important skills that businesses want in their employees. So it's heartbreaking, really, that parents don't value it necessarily in the same way for their daughters as they do their sons. Because for me, for every human being, you will probably be a better version of yourself if you're active in some way. And that doesn't mean, you know, emulating your success on a track, but actually just being part of something, a team in some way. It gives you so many different skills that are valuable in life.
Yeah, I mean, I always say, because everyone says to me, oh, but what are the boys going to be? What are they going to be professional in? And I'm like, no, that's not the reason they take part in sport. Like, they take part in sport because, like you say, everything that it's given me, that's what I want for them. I don't necessarily want them to go on and win gold medals because, yes, that has obviously changed my life. But actually, the thing that changed me as a person was the teamwork, the confidence that it gave me. Because if you saw me at school, I wouldn't even be sat here. Like, there is no way. But having to make conversation with people that I don't necessarily know that well, I'd have hated that. Standing up, reading, flipping Shakespeare or whatever, not for me.
Same.
But then you get me in the sporting world. Could I be a leader? Oh, 100%, because it just gave me a different type of confidence. That's why I want them into sport. And like you say, that's heartbreaking that people aren't seeing it as important for those reasons.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think, you know, I very much connect with what you say. I didn't end up an elite athlete, but I've worked really hard on the back of my love of sport as a child to have a successful career in sport, which I've achieved. So it doesn't matter whether you're going to be a professional athlete or not, if you can find this passion, you know, and it will apply for people in music or drama or the arts, you know, it's relevant, but find that thing that lights your fire every day. And, you know, it is a bit cliched, but it's then not work, is it? You know, it's your vocation.
Yeah, and that's how, honestly, I've viewed my whole career. It's never felt like a job. It's just been quite fun, to be honest. And Stacey, just to bring you in on the conversation, obviously you've done a whole load of research that focuses on issues around gender and sport and equality, and I just thought, maybe you could just talk us through about some of your findings and any information that I guess we can delve into.
I was thinking as you were talking there, and you mentioned almost the, I guess, more subtler forms of sexism and this way that we have to differentiate always between, we never say the men's version of the sport, do we? That's just assumed to be the sport. And one of the things that I've been looking at in terms of tracking media coverage over time is this shift towards what I've argued is a new age of greater gender equality in women's sport. So in this case, it's the research has been tracking the FIFA Women's World Cups over time, and we started the study in 2015. I mean, a phenomenal amount of progress has been made since that. When initially looking back at that period, you wouldn't have even known in the earlier years that a major tournament like that was taking place in media reporting. 2015 was the first time that BBC televised all of the games, the England matches live. And we've seen, one of the things when you mention language is we've seen this movement towards, move away, I guess, from the gender marking, less use of infantilising language, such as the use of girls or ladies in the reporting. I mean, it's still there and we're still seeing it. And you gave the examples of, you know, in cycling and in football, but a reduction in that over time. And one of the things, certainly in the context of football, a massive increase in the use of the term lionesses, which doesn't fix everything, but there is a case to argue that is a lot more empowering than always referring to ladies or women's football and the men's sport just being seen as sport. So I feel like we're balancing that and this progress that we're making, the increased visibility that we've seen in women's sport, everything that's happened since, you know, London 2012, really, you might pinpoint as a big turning point in the visibility of women athletes there. On the back of that Olympic Games, the tournaments that have followed in other sports. But then alongside that, when we see progress, when we see that move towards gender equality, we always see backlash. And I'd say that's the other major area that my research has been looking at. You know, what's happening in society? How are people responding to that? And unfortunately, as I'm sure we'll talk about today in some of these examples, a massive amount of hostility in relation to how some men are responding to these changes and this increased visibility. Because at the heart of all of this, you know, we're talking about sport as this last bastion of masculinity. And we've seen so much progress in other areas of society, but there seems to be something about that some men are still clinging on to, I think, as that male-dominated space.
I would agree with that. And I think for me personally, a bit to your point, I've had a relatively smooth kind of career journey in terms of not experiencing significant amounts of sexism, yes, in language, and yes, knowledge being questioned, and do you know about that, and how could you talk about that when you've never played, and things like that. But generally speaking, I've had incredible allyship from male colleagues around me, both same level as me and at a higher level, and that's been really important to me, because I think one of the things I'm really passionate about, and we are at Women in Football, is this drive around allyship, and that gender equality isn't about women solving that. We're half of the population. It drives me insane when people say, oh, women are underrepresented. No, we're not. No, we're not. So why are we even having these conversations about less women being in boardrooms or less women in leadership positions? So for me, allyship is incredibly important, and it's super important that men take responsibility for their own actions and are accountable.
Yeah.
Thankfully, I've not had too much. I mean, I've had the whole, going to chair a meeting and somebody kindly asked once, would I take the minutes of the meeting? And I kindly pointed out to them that it's difficult to do that when you're chairing the meetings. Perhaps you might like to do that. And my boss at the time, you could just see his shoulders sort of going. But, you kind of think they're small things. Yeah. But equally, like I say, there are women who have had horrific kind of treatment that's been very, very sexist, whether that's, you're not allowed in certain spaces, whether that's being basically ousted out of a leadership role because you're pregnant or you've got responsibilities. We hear about women leaving the workforce because, they're going through the menopause, and employers don't sort of understand that. People bullying women simply because they're women, people talking over them in meetings, like these things genuinely do happen. But to Stacey's point, the visibility is so important, and it's normalising every day women involved in all levels of sport. We've seen Sport England's campaign, This Girl Can, fantastic, normalising all shapes, all body sizes, all colours of women kind of participating, right through to obviously the Lionesses doing what they've done, and Olympians and Paralympians like yourself, like kind of really taking these positive role modelling so that everyone thinks, well, yeah, you know what, maybe I could do that one day.
And just to keep on the football, I guess, for the minute, there is obviously a huge, to talk about the pay gap, I guess, and even the prize money gap. Yeah. In football, the difference is insane, isn't it? Like, it's huge. Yeah. What challenges do football have to overcome that?
Yeah, I mean, cycling are a great example, aren't they, of where, there's more kind of equal pay, and there are other sports. I think football is so far removed from that. We have to sit in a backdrop of women weren't allowed to play professionally for 50 years, and we've seen the success in such a short space of time. But we also saw with Karen Carney's review, this whole set of recommendations around the quality for women and the provision, whether that's duty of care around women playing the game, whether that's actually playing standards, support facilities, everything, access to, you talked about it earlier, the men were on the track first and the women worked around them. That's very much the case. We've seen high profile cases in the press where men's changing rooms or men's facilities are not available, and so women are moved and so on and so forth. I think the women's game has got an awfully long way to go, and I think we can't even think about equal pay at this stage of the game. What we need to ensure is fair pay, and we need to ensure that there is a minimum standard at worst for all players. Some players are paid a pittance to apparently be a professional female player, and that's not okay. I think the average salary in the Barclays Women's Super League is something like £27,000 a year.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, some players are paid really high and others are low. So we've got to get to a place where women can make a living being a professional footballer first and foremost. And we've seen some great strides in terms of prize money with the Adobe Women's FA Cup, and so on and so forth. So there is progress, but it is slow, and it's too slow. And the big challenge around the Carney review is there's no investment plan.
Yeah.
Sits behind it. So the previous government backed the recommendations. I think all football stakeholders would absolutely subscribe to them. What we need is somebody to step up and go, we're going to invest in this.
I mean, just to bring it back to what you were saying about the money and the difference. So BBC actually did a study, and it found that more than 3/4 of British sportswomen earn less than £30,000 a year from sport, with more than 4 in 10 earning less than £10,000 a year. I mean, people can't live off that. You're asking these people to play and train the same as you are the male equivalent, but that's not physically possible. And then we wonder why it can't, like why women's sport doesn't move on, because you're asking these females to have a second job ultimately, because you can't live.
Or a third.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's absolutely insane. We've seen it with the move in netball as well, trying to professionalise with the Super League there, and there was a whole review done, and I remember being part of a consultation, and they were talking about, full-time salaries for netball players. I was like, this is brilliant, this is what's needed. And in all honesty, when the salary was suggested to me, I nearly fell off my chair, thinking, are you joking? You've got doctors, lawyers, you've got people with high careers training and playing in this semi kind of pro league, and you think they're going to leave a job like that for a salary like that. I don't know where it ended up, by the way. So, but the point is, it's totally unrealistic, and we want our athletes to be top of their game. We want them to not get injured, and yet they're working a couple of jobs. They're not in peak performance, and so something fundamentally, systemically across all of women's professional sport needs to change.
Oh, definitely. I mean, to be honest, my sister, she was on, I think, like £7,000 a year to be a professional road cyclist at the time. And like, there is a minimum wage now. It's not the same as the men's, but there is a minimum wage. And that is something that is a huge step forward, you know. But she was having to get up at stupid clock. It was like 4 a.m. because she was a postie at the same time. Oh. And you just think there is no way that her training sessions were optimal. You know what I mean? There's no way that she's had enough recovery time, she's had enough sleep. It's just not, like, she can't perform at a professional level, but she had no way else of making it work. Like, she had no way else of making a living, really.
Yeah. And that's the thing for me, and I don't know what your thoughts are, Stacey, but female athletes have to work so much harder, and that's actually unfair, but you do it. Yeah. Because you love it, and you're going to show people I can do all of this, but it is actually exhausting. We have to really protect people in terms of burnout and that whole piece of doing it all and then some, because like you say, you can't perform at an optimal level, and it's really unfair. So for me, yes, there is progress, and we should be thankful to a point.
I know,
but I begrudgingly say it.
I
want to be positively dissatisfied with this. It's not okay. We have to go harder, faster. More.
Yeah. I just think as women, that is us all over. That's our mentality. You have to feel thankful.
Yeah.
Why?
Yes.
It just shouldn't be the case, should it? It should just be equal. And I know that's easier said than done, but we literally go through life going, oh, I'm so grateful for that. I'm so grateful we finally have a minimum wage. It's hang on, that should have been put in like 50 years ago.
It actually really irritates me, almost as much as the fact that when anyone bumps into me, I go, oh, sorry. And I always Yvonne, why?
So true. Someone hits you with a trolley. Oh, sorry.
It's the northern in me.
Hit me. And just to stay on football just for a second, because a recent survey actually found that 89% of women in the game have experienced discrimination, and that is a number that went up from last year. Why do you think that number is going up?
Yeah, so we at Women in Football carry out this annual survey. We call it sort of the state of the nation. It has gone up, and I think there's two ways to look at that. One is the level of discrimination regarding specifically gender has gone up.
Okay.
The other is women are more confident when it's anonymous to call gender discrimination for what it is. And I think the anonymity piece is really important, because when we speak to members, there's a real fear about reporting discrimination, and there is a worry that if I do that, I'm the trouble causer, it's going to prevent me from getting promoted and all of these things. And these are, sadly, the reality of working in the football industry. So for me, it's probably more the latter. But what was really important from that survey and was the standout statistic for me was that of the women that do report gender discrimination to their employers, 60% said no action was taken whatsoever, and 16% said they weren't even listened to. So culturally within the game, we know there is some brilliant work going on behind the scenes with leagues, with clubs around creating more inclusive environments for women. But if women are being discriminated against because of their gender, and that's preventing them being the best version of themselves in their jobs, and no action is being taken, or they're not being listened to, fundamentally there is a real problem, and we have to address that. It can't be ignored.
Yeah, I mean, that's horrendous. Earlier, we actually spoke to England cricketer Tammy Beaumont to find out about her experiences in sport.
I think there's definitely been more as I've got into professional sport. I think, you know, it's not necessarily the obvious sexism straight out saying women shouldn't play cricket anymore. I think that's moved on from there. It's kind of the more micro instances of it in, like you say, kit not fitting quite right, just being expected to wear men's fit kit, or just, I think the one that gets me is sort of like, oh, and you get paid for that, as cricket being my job, and you're sort of thinking, yes, otherwise I wouldn't have said it was my job. But I think there's many microaggressions all the time, and I think it's getting worse on social media. The more and more we play on TV, the more it's actually betting that pushes it in cricket. People bet on you and then you underperform, and that's when they have a little dig or, you know, comment on your body type. Things like that just don't have a place in sport, whether it is sexist in nature or they're just fuming they've lost out on money. It's tough to take at times. I think I've never walked onto a cricket pitch trying anything but my absolute best, and at times I've not been good enough, but that doesn't mean I'm fat or a match fixer. I think is the one that hurts the most, because that really digs at your integrity, that I'd never do something like that. So yeah, I think there's lots of instances that are, because you're a female athlete, it's a little bit more pointy, I guess.
See, now for a direct comparison there, obviously I am married to Jason, who is also an elite athlete, and I would say, for starters, I get a lot more reaction post races than Jace does, but not necessarily about my performance as such. It can be about what I look like, or whether, you know, you've underperformed because of weight gain, etc., etc. And I mean, to be honest, it's not even necessarily just around performance. I feel like because I am in a sporting world, people almost feel like you're like free game, like because you put yourself out there. And I was just saying earlier, you know, I went to Sports Personality of the Year and someone commented about me looking pregnant. And it's so hurtful and it's so rude, and it's just something that as female athletes you almost go, oh yeah, well, I just have to deal with that. Yeah. Which is mad. But like Jason just definitely doesn't. Like there's very little. He literally wears the same suit every single time he goes to Pride of Britain. He's worn it like 6 years in a row. And has anyone ever said, hang on a minute, he's wearing the same suit?
I hope he switches up his tie.
Well, I take care of the tie. He has no choice. But I just find it so, and like I've had teammates, one of the most hurtful ones actually was when we came back from the Olympics. And obviously we'd all had this massive break. That's what you do after the Olympics. It's a really intense time. And it was the Europeans. And we rocked up at the Europeans, and okay, she maybe underperformed, but how does he know what her expectation was? On paper, she maybe underperformed because we were Olympic champions. But actually, we were just going to get experience and going to get points. We were still really young. And somebody made a comment on the commentary as well about her packing on the pounds. And it was so rude and it was so hurtful. And I just remember thinking, there is no way that he would have said that about a male athlete. You just wouldn't, you know what I mean? They'd probably say, it looks like he's lost muscle mass, you know, in a term that, all right, can still be hurtful, but that is very different language to what was used at a teammate of mine.
There was something I read the other day relating to a female football player, and I think in the commentary somebody had referred to her face looking like a smack bottom because she'd been taken off. And it's like, you wouldn't say that about male football players. So why on earth is that deemed to be okay? It's so not. And actually within football, we've seen and we've read pieces, and I've spoken to people who have sadly developed eating disorders as a result of people having an opinion about their body type. Like, we're all different shapes and sizes. We're all powerful in a different way. And like, I think people don't really consider the implications of their comments, and that's really dangerous.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I mean, to be honest, I think it takes a different type of mental toughness for female athletes because, like you say, the language and the comments that us females get are just very different. And like for me, I just knock things off. I'm like, oh, whatever. But that's because I am the personality type that I am. But I have known athletes who react and find it really difficult and really upsetting. And like you say, that can stem to all kinds of issues, not even just eating disorders, like any sort of harmful thoughts. And it's just different, and it shouldn't be, you know, like we shouldn't feel like, oh, well, that's just something we have to accept.
Yeah, no, totally. And we've seen, haven't we, such a rise in online abuse. That definitely came to the fore in our survey as well. There was an increase in people who have either experienced or witnessed other people experiencing online abuse as a result of their gender. And again, people thinking that they've got a right to just comment on whether it's about your knowledge or the fact that maybe you've mispronounced a name, but who hasn't? And we were having that conversation earlier.
Story of my life.
About mine. What did you think it was? Yvonne?
I'm like, how are we pronouncing this?
But like the professional, you know, you do that, but slip-ups happen. And, you know, I think certainly within the punditry and commentator roles, you will like certain people and you won't. But it doesn't mean the people that you don't like, you have to suddenly tell them you don't like. And we've seen a huge amount in relation to that. And we've been doing quite a bit of work behind the scenes with Ofcom around, you know, the measures that need to come into place and the sanctions for social media companies who turn a blind eye to this sort of stuff. Because again, it's just another layer of abuse that women in particular, and particularly women of colour, are having to endure. And it's not okay for doing their jobs.
Yeah, I mean, it's mad. I mean, social media is just a whole different conversation, isn't it? But the way in which that now works in the world is pretty scary. And I think that opens up a whole new level of, well, keyboard warriors, ultimately. People who wouldn't actually come up to you in the street and say what they say. And we touched upon it earlier about boardrooms being male only, and just in the sporting world, obviously, I would say that it's still very much, lots of the sports coaches are male. And then obviously the people above the sports coaches also still feels very male dominant. I mean, for me, I had my first female coach right at the very end of my career. So Monica Greenwood actually took us to the 2020, obviously it happened in 2021, Olympics. But before that, I mean, to be honest, I don't think there was a single. I'm trying to think quickly now back to my life growing up within British cycling. And actually, I don't think there was a female coach for a very long time. My sister came in on board as an academy coach, and I want to say she was the first female, but I can't say that as fact. But how do we change that? Like, how are we supposed to get, when it is so male dominant and we are living in a world where that's just been the norm, how do we now change that?
Well, I mean, there's a number of ways that can be done. And again, our survey, 21% of women that responded said they felt encouraged to forge a path to the top. So that's less than a quarter of women. So systems, actual investment in your female staff, visibility. So one of the things we do at Women in Football is very much championing and celebrating women at all levels, but particularly in those senior roles, because it's really important that you can see somebody in those roles, think, actually, I could do that one day. Challenging leagues, clubs. In fact, the Football Governance Bill initially was kind of coming through, and there was no reference in there around diversity and inclusion. So as Women in Football, we've lobbied hard for provisions to be in there because that's really important. This is a piece of legislation that will impact the way that football is run moving forward. And we know there's a very much a lack of females in the boardroom at Premier League and EFL levels. So it's important that we do that. I think as well, we launched our Open Doors agenda on the back of the Women's World Cup and the situation with the Spanish president, actually, and we were calling in there for a minimum of 30% representation of females on boards and in those senior executive positions, calling for independent non-executive directors in boardrooms, calling for transparent recruitment processes, because what happens is, and you'll know, sport is a very small world, football's even smaller, and actually people ring up the mate. You know, if I've been asked about being on one board, I've been asked about I don't know how many, I'm sure it's the same for you. You know, you have a profile, you've proved yourself, and therefore, oh, do you want to come on? You have to openly recruit for these positions, because diversity makes great business sense. It's not just about doing the right thing. You're bringing diversity of thought into your boardroom. And actually, if you do that, what you don't get is a Spanish federation all giving a round of applause to Luis Rubiales, who is defying resigning on the back of, quite frankly, horrendous behaviour.
I mean, that documentary's obviously just come out, hasn't it? And I mean, I'm only part way through, so I can't comment, obviously, like about the full story, but just even listening to the first bit of those athletes, they literally have won the biggest competition, yet in the background they were dealing with an unbelievable amount of disgusting behaviour, to be totally honest, and then not even having to deal with it on a world stage and it be everywhere, then to feel the pressure of everyone else then bombarding them, telling them you have to keep this quiet.
Yeah, I would recommend people watch it. It's quite an emotional watch, actually, and for me personally, it sparked probably the busiest 3 or 4 weeks of my career in this job, because you could not believe what was playing out in the press. First of all, it happens, then it's denied. What was really inspiring about it, and I think this is true of all women's sport that I've been involved with throughout my career, this togetherness, this sense of community, like players, even players who there was a big divide in the squad, and even players who had chosen not to participate in that World Cup, because actually this was sustained pressure and issues. The players were unhappy with a lot of the treatment from the federation and the conditions. Those players came and sort of coalesced around her, and then there was this international sports movement. And actually, what it shows is the power of that togetherness and the power of having that platform in the worst of circumstances has led to real movements in Spanish society in terms of where women sit and are positioned. Still an awfully long way to go, and we saw it actually within the Women's World Cup. You know, other countries coming forward about being unhappy about either coaches or the federations, or they've had to crowdfund to get to the World Cup. Absolutely crazy.
But you're right though, because one thing leads on to another.
Yeah.
Like, so once one issue arises, other people then feel brave enough, and it shouldn't be the case. It shouldn't be that one really horrific situation and then ends up stemming you in your sport to come up and put your hand up. But that is kind of how it works, isn't it? Like it brings confidence.
It absolutely does, and we know Tanya Gray-Thompson did an amazing piece of work around duty of care, obviously in sport in the UK, and those things are really important. Karen Carney signified it in the Women's Football Review about the importance of, and again, this was another part of Open Doors, it was about making sure the right policies and processes are in place to protect women, that women are always listened to, and really importantly, that there are sanctions for people who are behaving in this way, and we eventually saw that with Rubiales, and it's really important that women see action taken, as I said before, but desperately sad that had to happen, and disgusting that behaviour, there was no humility.
Yeah.
And we see that a lot, actually.
But with the sanctions, you don't think the issue comes from the fact that the board is male dominant? So, like, if we were to bring up an issue, like, I would feel very nervous that people wouldn't actually understand or help because there's not a female sat on the board.
It's really important that, and I think UK Sport England did a great job with the initial code of governance for sport, because it was mandated, you have to get your boards to 30%, and actually it's not in the next version, because actually publicly funded sports have moved on so far. It's really important that you are not the only female voice in a boardroom, because when you're that one, of course I'm going to stand up for this situation or that. Where there's more than one, that's where you get really, really positive change. And that's the same, I guess, in coaching as well. And we've seen Emma Hayes and other football coaches in particular talk about, there aren't that many female coaches and there needs to be more than one. And we've, with the Olympics and Paralympics, it's really celebrated for being the most female present kind of games. But actually, when you look at performance directors, you look at head of technical coaches, etc., there was a real lack. So we can celebrate some of these things, but we have to make sure that we've got to keep challenging. It shouldn't be a challenge. Women should be being invited, and not simply because we're women, because we've got the skills, because we've got the knowledge. Yeah. Exactly that. And I think that's a mindset that perhaps many women need to shift. We are good enough. We do deserve to be here, and we've got a lot to add because we think differently, and that's actually important for any business.
Hi, Maggie again. For over a quarter of a century, MasterCard has been a major sponsor of women's football and is proud to partner with Arsenal Women, the most successful English women's football team in history. With 60 trophies and a record 16 women's league titles, Arsenal Women are also the only British winners of the UEFA Women's Champions League. Discover more at mastercard.co.uk/impact.
Stacey, your book focuses on the feminisation of sports fandom. Can you just share with us a little bit more about this and how this can help make sport more inclusive, I guess, for women?
Yeah, I was thinking as you were just talking there, we've kind of looped around to return to the more overt examples of sexism with what was just being discussed there, haven't we? And there's increased visibility, and we've achieved that to some extent now, but it's not going to be enough to end sexism and misogyny. If we're going to be able to reach equality and justice on the pitch, I've argued that what we actually need to see is a gender revolution. Everyone from players, managers, fans, sponsors to take this clear and uncompromising stance against sexism and misogyny, because it's just incredible what we saw play out last year around the World Cup. Thinking in the context of wider society as well, and the Me Too movement and raising public awareness of these issues, and yet we still find ourselves discussing this last male preserve, this last bastion of masculinity, this space where men can supposedly be real men in spite of the wider changes that we're seeing in society. So I think, we are seeing these positive shifts. Women are becoming more visible, not just as players and fans, but as has been discussed in leadership roles, match day pundits, journalists, but we're not seeing the end of sexism and misogyny by any means. And a few examples in terms of my research looking at that area: high levels of misogyny in terms of men's attitudes towards women in sport. So despite this increased focus on women's visibility, this was the first research to look at how men football fans are responding to that and these changes. And there's room to be cautiously optimistic. We had around a quarter of supporters in a survey of 2,000 people that were showing progressive masculinity. But then the key line really was that 3/4 were in the over misogynistic attitudes. And here we're talking about really, blatant forms of sexism in terms of hostile attitudes towards women's participation in sport, backlash against this increased media visibility. A few quotes: women don't have any place in sport, they're useless at all of them. Women's sports athletes being described as not as dynamic or quick or skillful, not competitive. And this really, crude distinctions that ran across all generations. It wasn't like we were only seeing this with the older fans, and that for me was one of the most disheartening things from this research. It wasn't something that you could see was dying out, that actually many young men in society today are expressing these kinds of attitudes. And I think this all links up with what we might say is an anti-feminist backlash, as women are perceived to be making even very small steps towards gender equality. We get this backlash, and in some respects as well, a smaller group was showing covert misogyny or covert misogynistic attitudes. And this was really hard to challenge in terms of they would appear to be on board with gender equality. They'd be saying the right things, but in safe spaces, in male-dominated spaces, your pub, perhaps your workplace, your football ground, that's where they would really express what they thought about women's involvement in sport. So still a long way to go in that. And in relation to, you asked me about my work on women as fans, I'm currently working to get some research up and running in collaboration with the police around women's safety issues, because this is something that I don't think there's been anywhere near as enough work on. But just the fact that by stepping foot in a football stadium, women are facing a lot of challenges and issues that can be linked to safety in public spaces just by their very presence in this space. So that's something that I'm looking to address, working in partnership with key stakeholders to make sure that, you know, this is a space that should be welcoming, inclusive and safe for women to go to. And unfortunately, that's still not the case for everyone.
So just to bring it back, I guess, to social media, we touched on it earlier, because online sexual harassment is going up for female athletes. And BBC did a survey in 2001, which actually said that elite British sportswomen, a quarter of them, had received social media abuse of a sexual nature. I mean, I guess my question is, has social media led to more overt sexism and abuse in women's sport?
From my perspective, it certainly seems to give people a platform and the ability to say what they want without any kind of repercussions in a way. We saw it in our survey, so 19% of women who work in the football industry said they'd experienced sexual harassment in work. Nearly 1 in 5 just doing their day-to-day jobs.
I mean, that's a massive number.
Yeah, and it will vary in terms of what that looks like, but still 1 in 5, like if you think around your departments. So we want to kind of move that forward in next year's survey to try and understand where specifically, you know, which departments, because I think the work that Stacey's doing is amazing, because having the evidence and the data to be able to hold the industry to account, to track progress, to benchmark, etc., is really important. And we want to be able to say, I don't want to say all football is an issue, all of this, because actually there's a huge amount of optimism from women working in the game as well, and we saw that through the survey. But if it is nearly 1 in 5, then where are those women? Which departments? Because when we can kind of narrow that down, we can work with the industry and we can create solutions.
Yeah.
At the minute, it's very broad for a lot of this stuff. So that's just about another layer of sophistication. And, you know, it's challenging for small organisations to really kind of move that forward. I think online creates an avenue. And I think to Stacey's point, that it's really alarming to me that young men, because I've got 2 boys, they're both teenagers, and I think they think women's sport is totally normal, and they see me in boardrooms and like, that's normal for my life. And yet we have this online movement of hatred towards women, and it is now influencing significantly that younger generation. So that really worries me, because I always think, I take hope in, oh, it's okay, because once these guys sort of die off,
Yeah.
then we're
It'll be
all right.
gone.
We're plain
Yeah.
sailing, because a lot of people of a similar age, you know, like, yeah, absolutely. I also hear from members this kind of under the radar sexism that's kind of coming. So we'll say the right things in the right rooms, but then when we're alone or when
Yeah.
we're with friends and
They act
things
differently.
emerging in WhatsApp groups related to work or things like that, and women knowing they are basically the centre of that conversation.
Yeah.
And what can you do about that? It's such a daunting place.
Yeah, I mean, that is my next question. Like, what can the sporting institutions actually do to tackle, just keeping it, I guess, on the online sexual abuse? Like, what can they actually do to help that?
I think from an employer point of view, it's really important to be tuned in to your employees. So we've been working with a lot of the broadcasters on the back of the online abuse, particularly from the start of the year. And there has been a real willingness to engage with female colleagues, to understand, are they okay? Is there anything more? Like to listen, genuinely listen, and ask the questions. Don't just wait for somebody to come to you. That's really important. And then actually put into place things to support them. We've seen, sadly, broadcasters switch comments off when certain presenters, you know, or commentators are on, because that's helpful so that they don't have to deal with that online abuse, because that's going to be better for them. We saw a real shift when it was kind of at its height a number of months ago, where females didn't necessarily want to staff major events because you are in the spotlight. So not only is it what you're saying, knowledge of what you're saying, it's how you look, it's everything, and it was quite a lot. And I think for women that weren't in the firing line of the direct abuse, we also all felt it, because we were constantly having to talk about why this is a problem and what needs to sort of happen. So I think for employers, tune into your employees, actually ask the questions and listen, and hold to account the platforms. And there's obviously the online harms bill that's kind of going through, and there are things that platforms need to be doing, sadly not quick enough, but actually we've got to keep on. And there are opportunities, particularly at the moment with Ofcom, around the safety of women and girls online. We're involved in that as women in football. I know many other sports organisations are as well. We have to speak up, and we have to continue to do so, because this is a long-term problem. People are coming off certain platforms, and that's a personal choice, absolutely, but actually we shouldn't have to do that, so it's sort of defeating the object.
And then just one last question for both of you. So whoever wants to go first. What's one thing that you would like to see change for the better in women's sport during your lifetime?
Well, I was just picking up on what was discussed in relation to the online, and also I'm just thinking about when you were saying women choosing to switch off or not getting, distance themselves from it, this whole self-perpetuating cycle that we seem to be in, where then the only strategy is avoidance. And to me, this is just unacceptable. I think you then end up with a situation where you just creating more male-dominated spaces. I've seen it in my work on fans, match day stewards. Well, who's going to want to volunteer to do that role if part of the abuse is coming from these areas? You've got male-dominated match day policing. It's about the whole culture. If you think about what's happening in the sport, and the ways in which when women step into these spaces, they're routinely required to prove their knowledge, their status, whether we're talking in the workplace, whether we're talking as fans, whether we're talking as athletes, but in ways that just don't apply to men, this constant need to prove your right to be there. So I would say, in response to your question about what would I like to see change, well, I'd like to see something where, in my work on fans, women are not routinely required to just constantly prove that they have a right to be there. All these accusations about women in football being a joke, extreme hostility to their presence in that space. Women seem to be encroaching on men's patch, taking over their sport, and that causes some men to feel threatened. And then what we're actually essentially seeing is that this avoidance. You either go or you learn ways to stay safe. And we have high levels of sexism and misogyny. So some women just are not able to go to these games because they're experiencing gendered violence and abuse. So I'd like to see a way that we can change that. And what I'm putting forward is a reporting mechanisms. At the minute we don't even have the data on that. There's been so many really good initiatives. They haven't solved everything, but we've done a lot of work in the space of tackling racism, homophobia in football. I'd like to see mechanisms where we can challenge and eradicate sexism and misogyny, and be able to move towards creating an environment that is safe, welcoming and inclusive for women to be able to go and attend matches where they don't face these challenges.
So for me, God, I could list a million, but if I was pinned down to one, I would say more women in decision-making roles. Let that not be a thing anymore, because with that will come change. I'm very confident about that. So more women on boards, more women in executive teams.
For me, I feel like it's these conversations, I feel like we talk a lot about it, but you never see it, actually it's not happening in every single workplace. So yeah, I would really like, and I guess the same for me across the sporting industry, across boards, more CEOs, more PDs to be females. And like we said earlier, not because they're female, because they are good enough and they are better than everyone else applying for that job, because they're not being given the opportunities to even show themselves or prove themselves because they happen to be female. So yeah, for me, it's the same as you, I guess. Leadership roles need to be female, more female orientated, more female dominant, more, those roles are made for females just as much as they are males. Well, thank you both very much for joining me today. I guess, for me, there's still a lot of work to be done to tackle gender equalities within women's sport. But unless we have these conversations, unless we actually start talking about it, it's never going to change. So thank you very much for both joining me today. You've both brought a lot of insight and a lot of information that I guess a lot of people either wouldn't know or find really helpful in changing their mindset. I mean, the parent one still shocks me. So hopefully we can change the mentality, I guess, of people listening. So thank you very much for joining me. You've been listening to the Telegraph's Women's Sport podcast with me, Laura Kenny. Produced by Listening Dog Media for the Telegraph. Series producers for the Telegraph are Giles Gear and Sarah Mockford. For more women's sport content from the Telegraph, head to telegraph.co.uk/women's-sport.
MasterCard is proud to sponsor the Telegraph Women's Sport podcast, hosted by Dame Laura Kenny. MasterCard has championed women's sport for over 25 years. Discover more at mastercard.co.uk/impact.